All right, welcome everybody, and please feel free to use the chat if you have questions. You are at the webinar for affirmative action is on the ballot, understanding what Prop 16 means for Californians. I want to first introduce my friend who stepped in to be part of this event, Ricardo Ramirez, who is hosting with me, and then also maybe the panelists can just unmute for a minute and say hi. Dr. Mary U. Danico, this is really Mary's idea, and she kicked off this this webinar idea. So thank you so much, Mary. Mary, can you just at least wave and say hi? Okay, also Dr. Adrian Feliz, who is at UC Riverside. Thanks so much. Adrian has just a quick message for everybody.
Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Para las personas que deseen escuchar esta presentación en español, favor de pulsar el botón que aparece en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Abajo hay un botón donde dice interpretación. Si pulsan ese botón, podrán escuchar la traducción al español. Gracias.
So we will be recording this in Spanish so that you can share it also with friends and family. I also wanted to introduce Dr. Lori Frazier. And anyone else on this chat? All right. The other sponsors of this event are Regina Freer, Celia Lacayo, Maria Ledesma, and Natalie Masuoka. So thank you so much to the co-sponsors, and welcome to those of you who've joined us. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And please feel free to drop your name in the chat if you just want to say hi while we're talking so people can see who else is here. So again, thank you to Dr. Ricardo Ramirez for joining us here today. And since Dr. Ramirez is translating, I'm just going to talk a little bit slowly. But first, I wanted to just let you know how we ended up here. We're just going to tell our own stories, how we came to have this webinar, even though neither of us lives in California right now. My name again is Janelle Wong, and I grew up in a small town called Yuba City, California. It is a very rural place, 3 hours north of San Francisco. Ricardo also grew up in a rural place called Porterville, and both of us, I think, were tremendously shaped by attending UCLA. We attended at the same time. During the time that we were there, shortly after we arrived, we graduated in the 1990s. Proposition 209 passed, and it was an anti-affirmative action measure, and it's the law of the land in California today. And so we have deep personal ties to this fight in California, and we're just going to try to give some information that you can either use yourself or to share so that you can be an informed voter going into this election. So this is what we're going to cover today. What is affirmative action? What is merit? What are the stakes? And the California context. Who is supporting and who is opposed to Prop 16? We're not going to tell you how to vote, but we want you to be deeply informed. So affirmative action. Affirmative action really came about because to really enforce the 14th Amendment and equal protection. So after the 14th Amendment was passed, it was one of the Reconstruction laws, racial discrimination continued for hundreds of years through racial segregation and discrimination. And in the 1960s, it became clear that prohibiting discrimination was not enough to address racial inequality. And so affirmative action was introduced. Affirmative action does not refer to a single law or policy. Instead, it is a collection of policies and guidelines to address racial and gender discrimination in the form of, and this is what's key, concrete and proactive steps. So rather than passively prohibiting discrimination, affirmative action is proactive in orientation. And this can mean taking race into account in college admissions, but also in terms of hiring, contracts, and even recruitment and outreach programs. So recruiting and hiring, let's say, so that California teachers look like California students. I'm just speaking a little bit slowly so that Ricardo has time to translate. So here we can see some different questions about affirmative action. So those of you watching, what do you think the law currently allows in terms of affirmative action policy, especially in admissions? A, does the law allow for quotas and caps on Asian American students? Does the law allow universities to consider race as the primary and only factor in college admissions? If you're brave, you can put your answers in the chat. C, does the law allow for race to be considered in college admissions to account for past and present racial discrimination? Or D, does the law allow for race to be considered to meet a university's mission, such as diversity? Guess what? Only one of these is right. So the law currently only allows for race to be considered to meet a university's mission, such as diversity. So if affirmative action is restored in California, it will not allow for a racial quota or cap. It will not allow for bonus points or automatic racial preferences. These are some misconceptions about how affirmative action works. There is no racial quota or cap. That was outlawed and ruled unconstitutional in 1978. Race can never be the sole reason anyone is admitted, and it can never be the primary reason anyone is admitted. The law does allow for the promotion for race to be used to promote an educational institution's learning mission, that is the diversity rationale, and to ensure, for purposes of diversity, sufficient levels of underrepresented minority students, such that they constitute a critical mass. The Supreme Court has not allowed affirmative action and race-conscious admissions to be used to redress historical wrongs. It can only be used to address current effects of discrimination. So there's a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people think that affirmative action immediately sets a racial quota. That couldn't be farther from the truth. So let's take a look at what is often used to decide who gets to go to college. And that is this concept of merit. And I want to use the Asian American example. So one common indicator of academic qualifications are SAT scores. Some of you might have seen something like this or heard through even your college counselors, something like this. Asians must score 140 points higher on the SAT than whites to get into an elite college. But this is incorrect. This is based on a study done by Thomas Espenshade and his colleague. And the data were collected in 2009 before holistic admissions practices were put into place. This study is based on survey data of freshmen. It does not include their essays, for instance. It does not include teacher recommendations. It's based on self-reported indicators. There's no way to conclude from this data that Asian Americans must score a certain amount of points more than any other group. That's not the correct interpretation of that model, because that model has a lot of omitted variables. Dr. Espenshade, the author of that study, has himself said publicly that his data are not strong enough to be considered evidence of racial bias or discrimination. And even in places where the use of race is banned, like California, there's a gap in test scores. Why is that? We're going to talk about why that test score gap exists, but you should know that the SAT and other kinds of standardized tests are not the best predictors of first-year college grades. So 20 years of research show that the SAT only explains 12 to 13% at most of the variation in first-year grades, and is even less powerful after that. So I'm just going to stop here for a second. Adrian and Mary, I can't see the chat, and probably Ricardo can't either, so if anything is going on that we should be aware of, you can just shut the chat down as host. Okay. So basically 20 years of research have shown that, these tests don't do a very good job of predicting who's going to succeed and not, yet we still use them as a tool. Why, and they're considered merit. Why do Asian Americans score high in tests? Let's talk about that. So the SAT scores are very, very highly associated with family wealth and education. And Asian Americans, not surprisingly, score higher, partly because, as you can see from this chart, they demonstrate higher levels, typically, of household income and education. This is not everybody. This is the typical Asian American versus the typical white, black, or Latino individual. But most people would not have an admissions policy that used family wealth or parents' education to admit students to college. Yet that's what a lot of standardized tests capture. And standardized tests in this way actually capture those characteristics, family wealth and parental education, more than student aptitude, I would argue. One of the reasons that Asian Americans demonstrate high test scores is because of parental education. And why are Asian Americans the most highly educated group in the US? Many think it's because of something called Asian cultural values, a high value for education. But this is a stereotype, and many of you might be familiar with it, called the model minority stereotype. It's a stereotype to assume that Asian Americans have a special value of education and that no other groups have that same value for education. But that value for education doesn't explain the test score gap and why Asian Americans score high on tests and get good grades. Let's look instead at what sociologists consider the most important explanation for high test scores: selective recruitment. So keep in the back of your mind, where are Asian values most likely to be present? Maybe in Asia, right? But we see that more than 50% of Chinese immigrants in the US have a bachelor's degree. In China, where there are obviously Asian values, the rate is about 8%. If you look at the US's immigration policies, most high-skilled visas go to Asian people from Asia, Chinese and Indians. About 70% of Indian immigrants have a bachelor's degree, while in India, less than 15% of Indians of college age enroll in college. And the same thing is true of other Asian groups, like South Koreans and Japanese in the US. So this is a first easy critique of the Asian values explanation for high test scores and grades. Instead, we might be looking at US immigration policy as the driver of the model minority. And we can look even further. If you look at international students, the vast majority of international students are from Asia. By definition, that group is highly educated. So I just urge you to look, instead of at cultural values, to look at US policies and laws that have recruited or hyper-selected Asian Americans to the US. And this is a reason why we see very high levels of education and academic achievement among this group. It's worth noting that if we look at groups that have not been targeted by the US to receive visas based on professional skills and education, groups that came to the US as refugees and via family reunification, we can see that those Asian American groups, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Hmong, Lao people, and Bhutanese, for instance, demonstrate educational levels below the US average of 36% with a bachelor's degree. Again, a critique of the Asian values argument, since these groups that are below the mean are also Asian American. But the laws that brought them to this country are quite different. In contrast, and this is how you can see that the laws also make race, is that Mexican educational achievement is higher in Mexico than among Mexican immigrants in the US. So U.S. immigration policy is shaping educational outcomes in the U.S. One more look at educational values. This is just one measure of how much a group values education, but it's pretty straightforward. In this study, people were asked, how necessary is your degree for success? This is one way you might say, to what degree do people value education? Do they value a 4-year degree and think it's necessary for success? And you can see here, Latinx value education by this measure more than Asian Americans, and Blacks value education more than whites. What am I trying to say? That the idea that there's some groups that have an innate value for education or cultural value, especially that makes them more worthy of going to college, is incorrect and needs to be questioned. Instead, we need to look at structural barriers to education. Oh, Regina, would you mind muting? So finally, on this point, just to talk a little bit more about the less obvious kinds of barriers to education. My colleague and I wrote a piece that highlighted this scholarship, that research on implicit bias shows that teachers have lower expectations for Black and Latinx students with similar test scores and homework completion as their white peers and their Asian American peers. And these actually affect how students do on tests. So again, a reason why standardized tests are problematic for using as a measure of potential success or worthiness for going to college. So just to wrap up this section, the way merit is defined, like using a standardized test, also defines access. And measures of merit that are commonly thought to be objective, like SAT scores, do not accurately or strongly predict academic promise.
Leave the rest of it home. Let's eat, because I don't want to get cold.
So Regina, could you please mute your microphone?
No.
No, let's take off and mute her now. I don't have that capacity. I've been trying. Okay, there it goes. Okay.
So instead, these measures are strongly associated with wealth and parental education. And so we can better understand why we need affirmative action. Affirmative action is one, it's not the only, but it's one tool to increase diversity and create a better learning environment for all students, and to address systemic biases, like I just talked about, in terms of not just education, but also hiring and contracting. And Prop 16 not only extends to education, but also hiring and contracting. So let's get to it. I'm just waiting for a call. So here's the ballot measure, Prop 16. Prop 16 allows for diversity as a factor in public employment. That is, Prop 16 repeals a law passed in 1996 that banned affirmative action in California. For 25 years, there has been this ban in place. And the effects of Prop 209 in 1996, once affirmative action was banned, the effects were immediate. There was an immediate change in admission levels. And that affected mostly Black Native American, and Latinx students. Okay, well, some people say, you know what, we've seen an increase in enrollment of, let's say, Latinx students in the UCs. That enrollment's gone from 12% of new freshmen in 1999 to 25% of freshmen in 2019. But if you look at the comparison, you also have to compare not just enrollment, but the proportion of Latinx 12th graders who are graduating. So in 1999, 33% of 12th graders were Latinx. Today, that number is 53%. We are still seeing a deep lack of access among Latinx students, despite the fact that enrollment has been increasing. Enrollment has been increasing, but so has the population of students of color in California. There was a study published a few months ago from an economist at UC Berkeley that tracked tens of thousands of applicants to the UCs. And it looked at where they applied, where they eventually enrolled, and even their occupational and wage outcomes. What did that study find? Ending affirmative action in California 25 years ago has affected several generations of students. That study found that Black and Latinx applicants' degree attainment declined overall. So once the ban was put in place, we saw a decline in the proportion of Black and Latina students who were getting degrees. As a result of that decline, and you can see the study at the bottom of this link, and we can send it out also. As a result of that decline in degree attainment, wages among Black and Latina students and people declined, and it was actually mostly driven by declines among Latinas. And application patterns changed. Many Black and Latinx students did not even apply to either the UCs or the top UCs. So we saw a definite material loss after the banning of affirmative action in California. At the same time, there was no benefit shown by this study for Asian and white applicants. They saw no significant benefit in terms of occupation, in terms of outcomes, with the end of race-conscious admission policies. So the idea that Asian American and white students would flourish once affirmative action was banned really never occurred. But Black and brown students were hurt. So this is not some ancient study. This came out a few months ago. There's been a lot of confusion over Prop 16, and that's why we're here today. Because the ban on affirmative action is worded to say it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, sex, and ethnicity. But it really banned affirmative action. So a yes vote on Prop 16 means restoring race-conscious policies to address systemic discrimination. A no vote is to keep the ban on affirmative action in place. So some people have already voted and might not understand that a yes vote means restoring affirmative action. I count my father among these people, and I had to talk to him, and he actually had to go to the county clerk and invalidate his ballot to vote again so that he could vote yes on this proposition. The stakes really could not be higher. We're talking about generations of access to college and to jobs and to contracts. And you can see from these statistics that we have a long way to go, and passive treatment of racial inequality is not going to cut it. Who is supporting this proposition? The Prop 16 campaign is led by a multiracial coalition. It includes Vincent Pan of Chinese for Affirmative Action, Eva Patterson, a longtime civil rights activist and lawyer, who also heads Equal Justice Society, and Tom Sayens of MALDEF. It has been endorsed by almost every progressive elected official, including Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, and even celebrities like Issa Rae. These data were collected in September. This is from the Public Policy Institute, and you can see there's a lot of people who are still undecided on this proposition. And I think that's because they don't have enough information, which is why we're here today. It's a hard ballot measure to navigate because of the confusing language. You can see here where the coalition are divided on this issue. So if you look at party, Republicans are way more likely to oppose this proposition than Democrats. This is a different survey done by UC Berkeley and the Institute for Governmental Studies, and you can see that whites are more likely to oppose than non-whites, but the levels of undecided are very high across all groups. All right, thank you so much, Ricardo. All right, so I'm going to ask the panelists, if you want, you can unmute if you want to answer one of the questions. Mary, if you've been monitoring the chat and the questions, we also have a Q&A function. We have a few minutes to answer questions.
Yeah, so far, no question. There was one question that one of the panelists already answered.
Okay.
But there's really no other question. Folks are just saying that Oh yeah, and first of all, thank you, Ricardo. I mean, incredible. It's so hard.
Oh my gosh, Ricardo, I'm so sorry. I was trying to speak slowly.
I mean, it's incredible that you're able to do it because I was actually switching on to Spanish to hear your translation. Pretty incredible to do that. It's so difficult, I know. But I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience really appreciate this. Yeah, people are asking if this webinar will be shareable.
Yes, so we have recorded it. We did record it in Spanish because we could only record it in one language, but we will share both. You're welcome to the slide deck. We will also share out the recording, and people can watch the presentation.
Yeah, and what I noticed with the recording as I was listening to it is that I could hear you slightly, Janelle, as Ricardo was louder. So I think folks should be able to follow through. I think just mostly a lot of folks are thanking you all for sharing this information that they otherwise would not have really considered. And they said they know so many people. One person in particular recently works at a school, and she mentioned that there have been parents who've been doing really anti-16 campaign, and she's here to get a better sense of how she can talk to people and inform them. So folks are just saying thank you very much for everything. And they felt that it was very, very informative.
Great. And thanks also to Adrian for answering that question. Yeah, the UC and all of the UC does collect a lot of data on demographics, but it cannot be used, and it's not part of the rubric for admissions decisions. So that's why we saw the effect we did. Things that I think are really important for people to understand is that 50% of Asian Americans in the state actually attend community college. And so this could make more cultural, if we have affirmative action, that means that those students, we could recruit more directly people who share the racial background, professors and teachers who share the racial background of students. Right now, there's a huge mismatch in some ways between that students don't often have a teacher of their own racial background, and it's shown to be connected to their performance in schools. So the other thing is that this proposition will also allow for instance, race-conscious programs in the wake of COVID. So we know certain communities, and that includes Asian Americans, have been hard hit by COVID, and let's say Chinese restaurants that have been hit by anti-Asian bias. This allows for policies that address that bias directly, right? So I think we're looking at something that will really, that people need to know extends beyond education. Lori, Adrian, or Mary, do you want to add anything else before we sign off?
I wanted to ask if Adrian and Lori and Ricardo, and you too, Janelle, for folks who don't know who you are, because Janelle, thank you so much again for doing a 2.0 version of this. But I was wondering if you could maybe share with the group who you are, so if they wanted to reach out and connect with you, they can. And I was mentioning to Janelle that I had several students who talked about entering public policy work as a result of listening to her talk last week. So if you might just kind of introduce yourself a little bit so they have a context of who you are and the kinds of questions that they could potentially ask you.
You go first, Mary.
I think most people know who I am, so except for some of the panelists. So I'm Mary Udanico, professor of sociology, and I direct the Wegland Dow Chair for Multicultural Studies. I'm the past president for Association for Asian American Studies, and that's how Janelle and I know each other, and have been very active in social media in trying to inform folks about what's on the ballots, because it really, really matters, and especially with affirmative action. And I think for a lot of people, they tend to pit communities of color against each other, and in particular, Asian Americans with other groups, with a lot of lies, with the Harvard lawsuits, with Asians suing, against, and these are all so untrue, where majority of Asian Americans are very much for affirmative action. And it's really about fighting, for justice, right? And fighting for access for all of us, because it benefits all of us. So that's the work that I do, and a lot of my students are on the link here today as they were here last time. But it's so wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and being a part of it. So I'll pass it on to Adrian. We'll do like the stick where he pass it on to the next person.
Hi, everyone. Adrian Felix. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. I do research on migration politics, the politics of race, politics of citizenship and naturalization. I see a couple of folks have hands raised. I'm not sure if they had a chance to pose questions, but just to encourage folks to pose questions or follow up with any of us if there's any unanswered questions. Thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks to the panelists for organizing. I pass it on to Dr. Lori Frazier.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Janelle. Thank you so much, Ricardo. And thank you so much, Mary, for being in this fight and giving a space to learn more and grow. I am acting director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA, and I'm also associate professor of political science and African American Studies. And so I want to make sure that my classes are as diverse as California, and that people have the same kind of access and opportunity that I had when I entered an affirmative action program called Bridge Transition in 1995. I wouldn't be here as the first African-American female, and first African-American female and first woman of color hired on the tenure track at UCLA if it were not for the affirmative action program that I entered at the University of Illinois in 1995. And now, because of that program and because of access to opportunity, I am an associate professor at UCLA and acting director of the Ralph Bunche Center. So it is the same kind of access to higher education as a first generation college graduate from Chicago that I want all of our students to have access to, so that they can learn and they can grow and that they can go out and have access to great jobs, great opportunity, and a higher socioeconomic status for themselves, for their families, for their communities, because educational attainment changes lives, not just for those students, but for their communities and entire generations to have access and opportunity. I want to make sure that all the students who I teach, who are from a variety of different kinds of backgrounds, have the same kind of access and opportunity that was afforded to me, despite my high school, despite inequality, despite where I come from. And so it's important to me that when I look out into that sea of students, sometimes with more than 300 students in the classroom, that I see something that I'm reflecting back to them, opportunity and access, that they can look at me and see that they can make it, right? And that I look out and I see that I'm also encouraging, motivating, and inspiring the next generation of scholars in a diverse classroom. Yes, on 16 will provide greater access for opportunities for everyone.
Thank you, Lori. Hey, Janelle, can you stop sharing your screen so the audience,
sorry.
participants, thank you. Awesome.
Did it stop?
Yes.
Okay. So there were two questions. I'm not I tried to allow those folks to speak, but let me just see. Are there any other questions? Oh, who is against Prop 16 and why? So, you know, I think what we see is we know that President Trump is against 16 and has been working, the Trump Department of Justice has been working very hard to dismantle affirmative action, not only, you know, in the states, but at the national level. It's a group of, there are some very active groups within the Asian American community that have been visibly opposed to affirmative action. They don't represent the majority of Asian Americans, but they're definitely very effective grassroots organization that has been channeling their political power. And then I would say you can see from the polling that, you know, Republicans are much more likely to oppose Prop 16 than are Democrats. But there's still a lot of undecided people out there, so every vote makes a difference.
And I just saw today that the tide is turning a little bit, you know, that there are more people as they become more informed are starting to vote yes. On the Yes on Prop 16 Facebook site, I've been called an idiot on there by a lot of folks on there who question why I'm praising the organizers for doing the yes on Prop 16. But I think that question too is really interesting because it speaks to the folks who don't understand systematic racism or systematic oppression, that they just assume that if you just work hard, you should be able to get it, not understanding the privilege that they immigrate to the US with. And I'm talking about a lot of conservative Chinese communities who tend to who politicize this and have made this kind of their mantra, of being against Prop 16. So I think it is a lack of awareness. And so this kudos to all of you who are participating, because you are gaining information and really debunking a lot of the, what Trump likes to call fake news, right? But really the false narrative of what affirmative action is. So hopefully this will give you some meat to take back with you when you go home and talk to families and friends and community members.
Gladys mentioned in the chat that how can we decipher the confusing language used in the ballots? I think what is key is to make sure people understand who is endorsing Prop 16. Tons of civil rights groups, all of the groups that have been standing up for our communities all along, versus who is opposing Prop 16. Basically racial conservatives and Trump.
I think one panel, Stephen asked, how are you reaching out to African American and Latino communities on Prop 16? It is very important for them to vote yes in large numbers. Do any of you want to speak to that?
There have definitely been efforts with Dr. Shirley Weber, who has been phenomenal in spearheading this effort and this campaign. And so she has collaborated with Black Lives Matter, Los Angeles, and other kinds of initiatives to make sure that they're working in concert and partnership to get the word out, dispelling the myth about Proposition 16, and to work with partners around the state, and particularly here, the more recent work in more recent work in Los Angeles, to make sure that we're dispelling the myths in the African American community as well.
I don't see other questions. Any other thoughts or comments or questions that you folks might have? Any last parting words from our panelists?
Thank you so much for being here. All right, I think it's a wrap. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Kudos to you. Much mahalo from Hawaii. And we hope to see you soon in person. Let's have a reunion where we celebrate. Thank you everyone for joining us today.